Welcome everybody. We'll just take a couple of minutes. There's a few of you were in the waiting room, and we'll bring you in, and hopefully you've got some lovely lunch. If you are on Eastern, what do we do? Eastern Seaboard summertime. And if you're over there in WA, you're having a lovely brunch or an early coffee break. All right, I'll give it another minute. Jan, I would prefer that you're not taking notes, thank you, using your AI tool. Dirk or Tracy, can you type in the leave? We'll be recording this and we'll be making it available, but I don't think it's appropriate for... Hello from Adelaide. Can one of you type in? We have to type something leave. Maybe I'll do it.
Oh, I see. I understand.
See it?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. Eliza, yes, the sound is on. We've got someone. No, you've typed that, Tracy, to just us. You need to go in and find them. Hello from Tasmania. We'll just give it another minute. Let me type to Eliza. Yes. Okay, we've got various people. Okay, I'm going to make a start and kick things off. Thank you all for joining us from right around Australia and overseas. We've had someone ask, can you take screenshots during the session? The answer is yes, unless if your screenshot captures one of us, as I normally do, with my eyes closed, mouth open, looking like an idiot, I will be very cranky if you use that screenshot. Otherwise, knock yourself out and go for it. And I'm just not big on AI tools and notes. So we are recording this and we will make it available for those of you who want to play it back. And that would be our preference. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Clair Field. I'm an independent consultant in the sector, and I'm delighted to be joined today by two fabulous colleagues, Tracy Harris and Dirk Mulder. They'll introduce themselves in a moment, but I wanted to just say that despite me having the beautiful Gadigal lands behind me in my background, I'm actually joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people down in Melbourne. So thank you again all for joining us. Tracy, oh, sorry, Dirk, why don't we, I think you're known to everybody, but for the one or two people who might be joining us who don't know who you are, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. And I do love your backdrop, even though you might be down in Melbourne. I like that parochialism. Fantastic. Hi, everyone. My name's Dirk Mulder. I'm the founder of the Koala News. Although I'm not a trained journalist, I have 25 years experience in international education, and I'm coming to you from Durrag country in the west of Sydney today.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Dirk. And Tracy, over to you.
Just before I introduce myself, Claire, a quick question. Peter Mackey's come up and asked us if the chat's hidden from participants.
I think that might have been in the settings. Well, I'll deal with that. Yes. So we can see your questions. Don't worry. Yes.
So I'm Tracy Harris. I wear a lot of hats, and some of you will know me from my various guises as Principal of Tracy Harris Solutions, IEA board member, proud contributor to the Koala News, and currently I am the interim CEO of the Australian Guild of Education. And I think it's probably timely for me to just say, and people who know me will know that I use this phrase all the time, about the views that I'm going to share today are the Tracy Harris views of the world. They shouldn't be attributed to any of those organisations that I mentioned other than the principal of Tracy Harris Solutions. And I'm joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, also in Melbourne, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm going to throw back to Claire to kick us off.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tracy. So we have a really diverse group of people joining us today, and welcome to you all. And that includes, based on the email addresses, a number of students. So while some of you will be immersed in this data and will know it even better than we all do, we thought it would be useful, first of all, before we dive into what's happening in the sector and then where do we think it's going, and we welcome your questions, to type them into the chat. What we wanted to do, first of all, was let's just do a data-driven stock take of where we actually find ourselves today, particularly for those who might still be getting to grips with the sector, or maybe international students themselves. So when we look at who's here and who's studying, what we can see is that year to date for October, compared with the same period right back to 2019, pre-COVID pandemic, overall numbers and enrolments are up. But when you start looking at the different components of where those students are, there are some interesting, and I think for those of us in the sector, some concerning differences amongst where students are enrolled. So looking then at, and yes, I'm sure other people could do much fancier graphics, but this was done quite late the other night. So we're just giving you numbers, and we're giving them, if it's in red, that means it's going down. This is now looking at enrolment annual changes, right, year on year, and you can see the difference. 2023 coming out of COVID, with a government at the time that was not just welcoming international students, but actually welcoming workers, right? International students who would work because the economy was opening up. And you can see the large numbers of students who came back to Australia to study. And then what we've seen in 2024 is some continued growth in most sectors, but not in English language. And then 2025, and we can start to see ALICOS is really in contraction, and there's some tightening in the VET. Again, this is enrolments. What does the sector look like in terms of where those students are studying? And this is where you can start to see those differences. So VETs started off at about, 29, 30% pre-COVID. It's a tiny bit ahead of where it was when we're looking at 2025. Growth in higher education. Right now, 52% of all our student enrolments are studying in higher education. And you can see that the ALICOS sector has gone from a 15% share of all enrolments down to just 8%. And so, okay, that's the students who are here and studying today. What about visa applications? And this is for the first half of, the good folks at Home Affairs work on a financial year basis. I've never quite worked that out, but why? But anyway, so taking the first half of each of these years, again, so we're comparing like with like. And what I've done is disaggregate the data by onshore and offshore. And what you can see is when we look at 2019, that first 6 months, and the first 6 months of this financial year, there's been growth. A 30% growth in visa applications for students wanting to come and study higher education. Almost a 30% decline in offshore VET applications, and a 50% drop in visa applications for English language study. And then looking at students who are here and onshore, and you can see it's a decline overall, including a very modest drop for the higher education sector. So comparing pre-COVID with where we find ourselves today, first 6 months of both financial years, we're down 10% on the number of visa applications being lodged. Of course, it's not just the applications being lodged, how many of them are actually granted. And so again, I've looked at first half of the year, 2019, last year, and the first 6 months of this year. And you can start to see barely any change in higher education, right? Minus 1.4% in terms of grant rates. Sorry, these I should say are percentage point changes. There'll be good statistical people out there saying, Claire, there's not a percentage change, it's a percentage point change. So roughly around 90% of offshore higher education visas are still being granted. VET, we've gone from 90-odd% being granted, offshore visas lodged, down to about, well, under 80%. Right? I think some of that has to do with the way the genuine student test is being applied. Welcome that as part of the discussion. And again, we can see the impact on the English language sector. So not only are there fewer visas, visa applications, but we can see that the grant rates have gone from around 70% to under 50%. And then when you look onshore, again, the number of the relative grant rates have dropped for each of the sectors, including, I mean, higher ed used to be nearly 100%. That's now down to 90%. VET has gone from 90% down to just over 50%. So you've got a 50-50 chance as to whether your onshore visa will be granted. And again, there's been a slide in approvals or grant rates for visas for the English language sector. A number of people, when the next wave of this data comes out, don't just look at it like I normally do by sector, but they also drill into what does it mean for visas from different of our key source countries. And so again, this is first half year, and this is, oh, I should have put that. This is for today, first half of 2025-26. And you can see there are big differences in the visa grant rates for students from any one of our 10 key source countries, right? From the high in China of over 90% of visas are granted, down to just over half of visa applications for students from Pakistan, and other countries somewhere in between. And I know that many of you, again, will know this, but just sharing that because we do have such a diverse group who are joining us. So really quite interesting differences. China's always had high approval rates. Other countries have moved around. Bangladesh is currently nearly as successful with their visa applications as China and other countries in that part of the world are facing more visa rejections. Very last piece of data that I wanted to share with you. We are a sector that has a new acronym that we are sadly all too focused on and using, the NOSC, New Overseas Student Commencements, and this data is as at the 16th of February. And in total, we are at just over half of the notional allocations that are being given out for the year. We're at 53% of them. 60% of those are higher ed, and about 40% in VET. Now, we don't have the individual provider breakdowns for the VET providers, how they're travelling against their NOSC allocations, but fair play to the Department of Education. I think it's really good practice that they do publish this data on a weekly basis. And when you look at it, all of our publicly funded universities and the private universities, their NOSCs were set in different ways, but they are all at priority level 1, i.e. below 80% of their overall NOSC allocation. The TAFE higher education providers are priority 1, but I've given them an asterisk because they will always have priority processing. They have relatively small numbers, so they'll stay at priority 1, irrespective. We've got 16 private higher education providers that are at priority 2, i.e. they're between, now remind me team, 80 and 100%, has that got that right? And then there's 25 providers at priority 3. And I should say there are a small number of those 25 at priority 3 who either had a 0 allocation or they're part of a group and you're allowed to move your application, your NOSCs around. But nonetheless, so there's a small but growing number that are already above their allocation. And that's not, so far, there's no punitive measures coming their way other than visa processing slows down for any future students wanting to study with them. So I will stop sharing my screen and leave that, I guess, as a starting point for a conversation where we're going to share a few thoughts and ideas on a bit of what that data might mean. Where are some of the trends and issues emerging in the sector, and then throw it open to your questions. Tracy or Dirk, reflections?
Yeah, let me,
Tracy, in your
I'm
hands.
going to kick off, Claire, and probably just also say, if you've got any questions, those of you who have joined us this afternoon, if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask us, use the Q&A, and we'll be monitoring the Q&A section of the panel. So yeah, use that to ask us any questions you might have. There's a lot of rich data in what you've provided, Claire, that it leads to conversations that we're having in the sector at the moment. And the question that I want to go to, and Dirk, I'm going to put this to you, is that around the grant rates, so looking at those visa grant rates. You know, I know that we're hearing through Koala there's some really anomalous decisions being made out there by DHA. And so, you know, Dirk, do you want to just expand on this and what we're hearing and what this might mean?
Yeah, absolutely, Tracy. I mean, I think this goes to the point of what changes we've seen over the last few years in terms of how the government is using the visa process and visas to, for the want of a better word, manage and control the system of international education in Australia. So my first point would be, cast your kind of thinking back to when Claire O'Neill was Home Affairs and Ministerial Direction 107 first came in. Similarly to what we're starting to see now, we saw then erroneous and really erratic decision making around visa applications and around the assessment of those applications. And if we think back to some of those stories that we heard back in that day, I mean, the one that comes to mind to me was the French chef who wanted to come and study patisserie in Australia, and they were told that, you know, why would you want to come to Australia? You're in France and you've got some of the best, you know, cookery schools in the world there. The second one is around, if I remember this correctly, there were two sisters that applied, and I think it was from South America. One got a visa, one didn't get a visa. So we're the system is clearly being used as a filter to control the numbers that are coming through the system. That combined with, and again, go back to that time, lengthy delays, and Claire, your data on Pakistan, I think, is a really good indicator. And from my memory, there were a number of people, particularly in Western Australia, that were crying out at the time, where there were a number of what they believed to be absolutely genuine students, solid study histories, great financials, and the post in Pakistan was just sitting on them for a very, very, very long time. So fast forward, and I'll answer your question that you've just asked, Tracy. We're starting to see that again. And I guess I look at the system that we've got in place now. The government tells our sector that there are good ponds to fish in and there are not so good ponds to fish in. Only casting back a couple of months ago, Bangladesh went up to level 1. So it's probably fair to say that Bangladesh was a good pond to fish in, or that was the indication from the government. Recently in December, that got dropped 2 places back from level 1 to level 3. We're now seeing that come through. So to answer your question, Tracy, directly, what I'm hearing at the moment, particularly out of Bangladesh, is that there are a number of erroneous applications. There's been a number of applications that have been dragged out that have been sitting on desks for a very, very long time. I had one provider saying that they had around 50 that have been sat there for a very, very long time, and they just think that that is just unfair and elongating the process. Interestingly enough, and John Ross from the Times Higher Ed, and thank John and Claire's been following this as Tracy and I have, looking at some of the decision making and some of the rejections that have been coming out. The latest one, which is really concerning, I think, for anyone who is looking at onshore recruitment that has a T&E operation in a country or where T&E is growing, is that rejections are now being made on the fact of, well, why would you want to go to Australia when you can actually undertake that degree or that program in country here with an Australian provider? So that actually is I think that just is really, really concerning. The broader part of this, I think, is if we didn't already know it, we absolutely know it now. If you think back 10 years ago, we had a visa system that was very objective. Those people applying for visas knew the bars that they needed to jump, and visa officers were in congruency with those bars. So it was very transparent. It was a very simple process that you would go through. The difficult thing now, I think, is that there's so much grey that's been brought through the previous GTE test and the ministerial directions that have been brought in, and now the new GST test, that we're now seeing decisions that are being made by visa officers that are inconsistent to other posts, that are inconsistent to the same post only a matter of time ago. And they're really hard to be able to see through that. As an institution or as a student, being able to understand what those objectives are, understand the signals that the government are actually trying to bring forward, is just becoming a really murky place. So I hope that answers your question, Trace.
Any thoughts, Claire?
Oh, I think Dirk's nailed a number of issues, and I'm also keeping an eye on the questions that we're getting. I mean, when the genuine student test was first mooted, I'm on the record as saying I could see it would really impact the vet sector, prove how studying in Australia and spending all that money was going to be good for your career and deliver a return on investment. And if you're going back to a country that doesn't itself have a strong vet system, then wages for having a vet certificate or diploma for Australia were going to be hard to explain. Not to say that that doesn't mean that the student might not genuinely be looking for a future career in Australia or indeed in a third country, but I always had the view I could see merit in the student test. We should be asking students to be thinking about the significant investment that they and their families are making. What I didn't expect to see was it to raise the questions for some higher education student applicants that it has. To my mind, an Australian higher education degree brings currency and value in labour markets around the world. And I've been really surprised to see, it's been patchy, but to see sometimes questions being asked about students applying to do higher education. So I think we've got those two issues. We've got a couple of questions also focusing on ALICOS and I think a bit in the chat. And I just want to point out, and we'll probably talk about this a bit more, a key issue for the English language sector and the reason for the decline is there's an issue around grant rates and consistent decision making. There's also the cost of visas. If you're coming to do a standalone English language course and it would cost you $5,000 or $6,000, a no-brainer that you're not going to want to spend a couple of $1,000s on your student visa application fee, particularly if there is an issue. I think there was another example where there was a mature age woman with a career wanting to come and do some English language study in Australia. No, sorry, you're not a genuine student. Well, there's your $2,000 gone. Thanks very much, because you're an offshore applicant. So we've got a few intersecting issues, and Dirk's right, they're bubbling to the surface again with some inconsistencies from the outside in terms of decision making. And what about you, Tracy? Come on, you're thinking and writing about this.
Well, actually, I'm just because of time and there's a lot of questions for us to answer, I'm going to segue into the Ellicott sector
Okay,
because
good.
I think it's really important for us to not to miss this discussion about the Ellicott sector, because what's happening in the sector, and for those of us who've been around for a long time, is really disheartening to see what was an Australian flagship, the quality of our English language teaching being essentially decimated. And Dirk, I'll come to you as well. So just heads up on that, because I know you've written about it in the Koala just this week. One of the things for me, and I had a conversation with Ian Ed, who's the CEO of English Australia, about this at the end of last year. Because there haven't been, and fortunately, there haven't been mass college closures in the English language sector. And I'm going to say yet, there's still, that they're being hit so hard, it's a yet. It's almost an invisible loss to the workforce. And I think, Dirk, you were reporting in your figures about the number of FTE positions that have been lost in the sector. So we're not just talking about the loss of students, so those visa rejection rates, those that are never just applying, that are never applying because it's a $2,000 fee. We're also talking about massive job losses of really talented experts in English language teaching. We lost a massive number of people coming into, because of COVID, we lost people from the sector who then went off and, redeployed into other areas. And we're seeing this happen again. Well, what happens when is there a third wave? Can we resurrect it? And finally, just before I throw to Dirk, the question around that $2,000, the current climate is the real issue. We've got the revenue that has been budgeted by the current government for other election measures that they promised at the end of last year. So we've got that as a barrier to the reduction in the $2,000. And this is something I hope we'll talk about later on, the current climate, because I've got some real concerns about where Australia is at right now. The thought that the government would do anything for our sector that might flare up Angus Taylor or Pauline Hanson being able to talk about this government not being responsible around migration. I'm not sure that I see that $2,000 dropping anytime soon. But Dirk, you covered this in a story this week, English Australia's report that came out.
Yeah, that's right, Tracy. So each year, and one of the cornerstone documents I think that English Australia produces is a student visa market analysis report, and so that was released last week. And to be fair to all listeners, it's a members only document. So if you do know a member of English Australia or you work for a member college, please get in touch, because it is a fantastic document. But in it kind of lays bare the situation that the Ellicott sector is facing at the moment. And I think the wording that I used was it's a post-mortem of what's gone on in the past 12 months. So it really shows, and obviously the data that Claire put up shows that that Ellicott numbers, both in terms of visa grant rates, in terms of students studying, particularly in independent Ellicott programs, are just tanking. And for the sake of time, I might just give you one headline, and just to give you the sense of where we're at. 20 years of investment of growth have been wiped out. 2025 saw 25% fewer independent Ellicott visa applications granted than in 2005. So that's 20 years worth of work lost, and we're a quarter down on that. So when we think about ELICOS, and I remember as we were coming out of, at many stages, right throughout the sector, we often talk about ELICOS being the canary in the coal mine. Now this is going to be slightly different because it's structural. This isn't right across the board, and clearly ELICOS has been targeted in this sense, but it's not healthy for vet. It's not healthy for higher education to have an ELICOS sector that's on its knees, and the pathways that actually then moves into is now at stake as well. Now, whether that's an oversight or anything else, I'm not sure. I've certainly been in forums where the minister has been asked this question. He would suggest around the $2,000 that numbers were starting to tail off before that $2,000 charge came in. And if I can be a little bit controversial or flaring, Tracy, to your point about being baked into the budget, I mean, it's absolute BS. I mean, you only got to watch Insiders on a Sunday morning or pick up any of the major newspapers to know that this government financially at the moment has black holes left, right, and centre. And to think a few $1 million worth of a visa fee to save a sector is not a good investment, I just find is absolutely ridiculous.
I don't know, Claire, if you want to make any other comments.
I'm conscious of time. All I would
Yeah.
say is, and not that I'm one to speculate on budgets and money that's available, but I do wonder if Treasury have done their calculations on X number of students and X number of visa application fees. If visa applications for English language fall off a cliff, that's a lot of $2,000 that won't be being paid. Right, so we won't have the student numbers, and that contributes to growing interest in reducing international student numbers from far too many political parties, in my view. But if there is an estimate that people would be paying for these visas, remembering that ELICOS sits outside of the NOSC. I wonder if we don't hit a point where actually it's not it might be baked into the budget, but actually it delivers a whole lot less revenue because there's a whole lot less people willing to put their money on the line for the cost and the likelihood of a rejection. So I guess that's just something else to be thinking of.
Mm. We turn to NOSC, because there's a few questions in the chat about NOSC, and you covered the figures in your slides. One of the things that is on my mind at the moment is the priority 3 institutions, the HEPs that are already in priority 3. And as you said, Claire, we don't have visibility on the vet sector because DUA doesn't choose to publish the same data, which just leads to this complication of having multiple departments involved in the international education sector. So we don't have that kind of transparency across vet. So we're only seeing it with the HEPs. There's 2 schools of thought, and I'm interested in what you're thinking around NOSC. Is that with those 25 private HEPs that are already in priority 3 by the 16th of February, so 6 weeks into the year, and so what does that look like? One of the questions in my mind is, should we be alarmed by that on behalf of the private HEPs? Is oh my God, they're ignoring what the government's direction is to them. And so is that on, their governing bodies? Are they looking at is this a deliberate strategic decision to go above the NOSC? Recognising, of course, that the formula that was used for the private sector was so, almost, I'm going to use the word adversarial against the private sector. So what do we think this is saying to us about decisions in the sector? And what do we think the government's response? I think that was one of the questions actually was, what impact might this have on the NOSC calculation going forward?
Sure. So I think there's 2 parts to that, and I think the NOSC calculation going forward, I think the sector is relying on David Turvey and the good folks in the interim ATEC to work that out. But what I will say about where it's currently at, most of those providers, so there's a small group of providers at level 3 who had a 0. They've allocated their numbers elsewhere. But for the 20 odd that are at priority 3 right now, overwhelmingly, they had really small numbers, right? These are providers with domestic student cohort, and their NOSC might have been 60 students, right? And if they've chosen to take those students and have them start the year ready to go, maybe they don't have a huge amount coming in semester 2, or maybe they do, and they're prepared to wear the consequences of they will be prioritised low. I mean, if we're to trust, and I think, we should, as an ex-public servant, we should be trusting what the government is saying, which is that this is not punitive. This is about, right, and I think the last time we convened to have this public conversation, we were talking about how, with the first attempt at the ESOS legislation and having caps within it, and the legislation it was left to sit and wasn't passed. And what were the other mechanisms open to government? And at that stage, the sector was thinking that there would be repercussions if one went over caps, and they were there to limit activity. Well, they have a soft limit, which is it just takes longer for your visas to be processed. I think it's something to keep an eye on, but I think if you've only got a NOSC of 60 students and you're a bit above that, I don't think if I'm a governing council member of a private HEP, I'd be too worried about it. What I think worried government was a number of universities, publicly funded universities, also went above their NOSC in 2025. And that has an issue in terms of your domestic and international student mix. So I think it's much more of an issue. Universities are tracking at priority 1. Some will be coming up, I think, close to priority 2. Others will be comfortably down at priority 1. And that has revenue implications for them. I think it's a bigger issue in public institutions where there's a much stronger emphasis for government on having a good mix of domestic students and international students.
Yeah. Anything you want to add to that, Dirk?
No, I mean, what I would say is I think the NOS system was brought in. I think it was ill-conceived when it was brought in. I think we're still playing with those teething issues as we go. And I think almost on an action research sort of methodology, over the next couple of years, we're going to keep improving it. There's still lots of questions around reallocations, around the methodology itself, around the strangulation, I would almost say, of some colleges who have a really low NOS compared to what their CROCOS registration is, and what they've committed to in their ongoings and over their future years compared to having their income restrained coming in at the front door over the next year or so. So I think the question really is around, through these next couple of these iterations, how are we going to improve the system in a way to ensure that, pardon me, that certainly privates or people who don't necessarily have fixed assets that they own, that they've got large outgoings, how they can maintain those over the forward time. But it is one of those points. We saw another college close this past week. I think they had a CROCOS registration of 320. They've got a NOSC allocation of something like 65. I mean, those numbers just don't stack up if you're running a business in that space. So let's see how we go over the next couple of years. Let's hope that the foot comes off the pedal somewhat. Understanding that we are working in a more managed system now.
And this probably goes to the question that's in the chat around what do we think the calculation might be going forward. And Claire, I'm interested in you sharing some thoughts on your appearance at the ATEC hearing, which happened to be the day of the leadership spill. So you didn't get any curly questions from the opposition, but please share your thoughts on ATEC. Quickly though, before I throw to you on that, I'll just share my own view around, just a thought around the NOSC is that we've got an ATEC that is going to determine what the maximum level is. Maximum, I use that that's the term in the legislation. Of course, it's not a cap because we can't actually cap because of the things that we've just talked about, but they are the ones who are going to determine what the methodology is. One of the concerns that the sector has, and this came out in the submissions to the Senate inquiry into the legislation, is that none of the ATEC commissioners need to have had any background in international education. And in fact, we've seen, and the second part is, nor do they have to have had anything to do with the private sector. And so I think private HEPs are quite concerned about how this, anything to do with the tertiary education system, decisions being made by ATEC, that they're going to be purely publicly focused, and what's the impact going to be on the private sector. And then that leads to, and then what are they going to do about allocations for the private sector, because the public sector numbers are going to be done through mission-based compacts. Still question about what's the methodology, but I think the privates are particularly concerned about that. So share your experience about appearing at the ATEC hearing.
Sure. Well, thank you. There were no questions of myself or Professor Andrew Norton about the international student caps, and the bits that I missed, reading back over the transcripts, or you can watch it. While there were officials there from the Department of Education with international education responsibilities, again, most of the questions, all of the questions that were coming, were much more focused on how the ATEC would work, who would be the commissioners, when would the job ready graduates funding be fixed. And you're right, the discussions were focused very much on public universities. And I think, that's not necessarily from an international student perspective, but from a domestic higher education perspective. Obviously, that's where the overwhelming majority of students are, and government investment is. I think what was pretty clear in, maybe a bit unspoken, but pretty clear in people's minds, and it will go to assuming that the legislation passes, that there is a deal done presumably between the Greens and the government, some tweaks to the current legislation. I do think actually having a group of people who are responsible from the public university's perspective of thinking through funding for domestic students and ensuring a healthy mix of international students, I think that's a good thing. I think that's a discussion. Very often we have an international education discussion where we'll have, most of the people who are joining us today are international education specialists. And then you've got others who have a much more of a domestic lens. So the two do interact. I do think it is different in the both private university and non-university higher education providers. And also ATEC, if it's going to be setting NOSCs, there's a whole vet sector that's out there, right, which also needs to be thought about. So no, the focus was, will ATEC be independent enough? What expertise will it have? What will it draw on? But not in any way getting into how the NOSCs will be calculated. But last thing, I do sound like I'm just a cheerleader, but I have been deeply impressed by the analytical work and research done by Jobs and Skills Australia, and that goes to an excellent commissioner and 2 deputy commissioners, and David Turvey as the executive or chief executive officer has really been very strong. So I think having him in that role as the interim ATEC CEO sets them on the path to be doing some really good data analysis around it. Then you've got to bring it all together. We're running out of time. We need to be thinking about the future. And Tracy, you were going to share some views on climate in the sector, and probably I think it would be worthwhile, and someone has prompted us, not just within Australia, right? Again, when we're recruiting, students have other choices. Be fair to say, geopolitically, they're not all very welcoming either, some of our key competitor countries. So your thoughts on what's happening within Australia, and then maybe Dirk or you, what's happening elsewhere?
Mm. So the thing that is really vexing me at the moment, and is the thing that keeps me awake at night, is the current environment that we're seeing happening. The oh, I've lost my word that I wanted to use. What we're seeing around anti-migration sentiment in Australia at the moment, the anti-immigration sentiment in Australia. So what we're seeing, that those terrible comments from Pauline Hanson about Muslims, the burqa stunt last year. Angus Taylor's comments this week this week or last week about, if you don't share our values, then you shouldn't be here. I'm seeing this rise in anti-migration sentiment, and of course, there's the major issue that I have about that is what that means for our international students that are here. We saw the racism at university study released this week as well. We're about to welcome a whole lot of new international students, and what kind of welcome are they going to have when they land in Australia? And I know that it's a loud, smaller fringe, or sorry, not fringe, smaller part of the population. I think they're less fringe than we would like to think that they are. And so I am deeply concerned about the kind of student experience our new students are going to have. I was reflecting back on that webinar that we did at the end of 2024, and I think my plea at the time then was also, as we were ending, we need to think about the students. And so I'm going to come back to, we need to be thinking about the students. So of course there's a marketing message that's being sent globally about what's happening here in Australia, and the fact that we might be unwelcoming or whatever that might be, but I'm far more concerned about what are we as a sector doing to make sure that we wrap our arms around our students, to make sure that they, because we can't do anything about what might happen when they're out on public transport or whatever might happen wherever they are. But at our institutions, what are the messages that we're sending? I've been in international education over almost 35 years, and I think this is the time I'm most worried about this rise in really racist sentiment that's happening. So it's a somber note to share, but it is the thing that really I find deeply concerning.
Yeah, distressing.
So I'm not sure who wants to take
Dirk.
it from there.
No, Dirk, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it plays into, I guess, this theme of isolationism that's going on around the world at the moment. And if you run through the major four, and then I'll talk about maybe a couple of emerging destinations. But if you look at the United States, I mean, if you're an international student and you're sitting in Bombay or Zhejiang or somewhere in China, and you're looking at ICE running around the country and doing what they're doing, and you then think back to the Trump administration's view on Harvard, on visa holds, on all of those things, and you would say that the US is a place that is fairly unpredictable policy-wise at the moment. But then on ground, what actually is the feeling on ground? And I've still got a lot of friends in the United States, and it probably hasn't changed too much on ground. There's still a bit of a battle going on, but the visuals that are booming around the world at the moment aren't very good. So the US, possibly has come off a little bit in terms of that, and that's showing up in some of the reports that we see that IDP put out around destination surveys, those sorts of things. I'll go to the UK next. I'll leave Canada for last because I think Canada's a really unique point. And I know that Douglas Proctor was on here, but he's had to take a flight up to Washington. So, back to Toronto from Washington. I'd be really interested in his view. He's just obviously left Swinburne University to take up the lead role at York University in Toronto. But if we look at the UK, I mean, over the last little bit, they've pulled away from Brexit. They've had Brexit. There seem to be more isolationists from Europe every day, although there seems to be now views around, well, was that good? How much did it cost us? Where are we at now? How are we managing our economy in that way? And some of the migration things that go along with that. The domestic higher education space is not in a very healthy position at the moment. So internationally speaking, the UK, again, when you're sitting in Bombay or Zhejiang or somewhere else, you look at the UK and you think it's it's been a traditional destination for a very, very long time with good, solid outcomes, but it's just seems to be missing a beat there somewhere. It's not, it doesn't seem to have the full package. Then when you turn to Canada, Canada's probably the country that's a bit of an anomaly at the moment. And still, I think, we'll see this pan out over the next 6 months. It clearly pulled back on its international education, how would you phrase it? Welcoming number of allocations, however you want. They've consciously retracted their sector in a very major way, which has sent, I guess, signals right across the world about how welcoming Canada might be. Ironically, on the back of the US, geopolitically around the world at the moment, Canada's really stepped up and stepped in and has become more of a global leader and a global welcomer of bipartisan relationships, and has moved to engage more fully with the world. And typically, when that happens, you would think that immigration and investment and those types of bilateral engagements also thrive. So my tip would be that over the next 12 months, Canada will take its foot off the gas a little bit when it comes to international students. I think structurally it's been in a very poor way. If you think about things and issues that were brought up 12 to 24 months ago, things like fraud in the visa system. I mean, they didn't even have a system where visa officers could check whether that was a valid visa application. So I think there's been a lot of work going on in the background over the last 24 months in Canada to get some of those systems up and going. And I think that they will start re-entering that international education space with a bit more confidence, being able to do that with systems. So if you think the big four, with Australia probably being the least affected to this point, have all slowed down somewhat. The emergence of places like Germany have just been incredible. And there was a story last week, Akos Kirili, who's based in Germany, wrote in for the Koala, and they've just topped 420,000 international students in Germany, and that's a record for Germany. So when we start looking at emerging destinations, we're seeing them pop up around the world. The question becomes, we probably know that the UN has predicted the mobility of international students to continue to grow over the next 10 years. The question then becomes is, with that growth, where does that growth go? And do the big four, are we going through a bit of a policy slump at the moment, but then bounce back to recapture some of this market? Or are we going to see the additions of other countries similar to Germany that are going to take advantage of this and be able to attract students? The other thing to really watch out, and a key indicator, is those countries that are introducing English taught programs where they're not English speaking countries. And we're starting to see those pop up. We're starting to see it more and more in France, more and more in Germany all the time. So keep your eye on those countries, because they're going to start making a dent in that international mobility.
Sure. Tracy, I'm going to add just a couple of extra observations on the UK. Building on what Dirk said, you've got Nigel Farage, who is as racist as Pauline Hanson, and I don't normally say things quite as directly as that, but that's my view, creating quite a hostile climate. But on the other hand, you also have something that I don't think we've talked about here in Australia yet, which is in the UK. So Dirk's right, their universities are experiencing real financial stress. And there is a decision that was taken in the courts this week that will add to that. University College London has paid out £21 million, so about $50 million, to students who had domestic students who had a poor study experience during the COVID pandemic. Because in the UK, you pay lower fees for online study. There are now 30-something, about 33 or 34 other universities who are facing a similar class action. At £5,000 per student as the payout figure that was reached in the UCL settlement, UK universities are going to be in extreme amounts of difficulty, and that is going to turn the government's attention to where on earth do they get the funding to continue, right, with their higher education sector. And I want to say one other thing. I said it in a discussion I was in yesterday. The other thing we're not talking enough about, go with me on this, is defence. Goes to geopolitics, it goes to the role that Canada is playing. Countries all around the world are looking to and going to need to invest more in defence because geopolitically the world is more uncertain than it has been, particularly for Western countries, for all of our lifetimes. And if we are putting more money into defence, we have less money to put somewhere else to be investing. Is that into higher education? Is that into domestic vet? And what does that mean? Not only the growth in youth populations, particularly in Africa, but that UN modelling of increasing demand for international education because countries do not have the resources to educate all of their growing population, and people wanting to explore the world in difficult and uncertain times. So we're going into some real periods of change with stress on budgets for lots of countries and demand for safe and welcoming, going to your point, Tracy, welcoming places to study. And it is beholden on all of us. And we've had comments and questions about how do we better connect domestic and international students. And I will say some providers do a magnificent job with that. And it would be wonderful to see case studies shared on what really works and how do you do this. I think there's quite a bit that the sector can learn from itself on that.
Mm. Is there anything in the chat we've got 5 minutes left that anybody wants to tackle?
Can I pick up on a comment?
Anthony
Cahalan mentioned, if Dirk's example is correct, of students being denied visas with the suggestion that they studied Australian T&E course in country, this is in direct contradiction and negation of Minister Clair's encouragement for us to develop T&E offerings to increase the number of international students studying Australian qualifications. Thoughts? Anthony, I think you nailed it. When I saw it come through, I absolutely, my eyebrows pricked up and thought, this cannot be happening. So I am investigating this as an investigative piece, and I would put a call out that if anyone else has any examples of this, please get in touch with me. Dirk@thekoalanews.com is my email address. Happy to receive any information. Obviously, don't want anything with student names on it or anything like that, but very interested in finding out what the enormity of this might be.
And I'm just going to take one that goes to onshore transfer. So we haven't talked about that, and I think that's another big change that the sector's coming to grips with. So most students choosing to study at another provider when they're already in Australia, providers not paying commission to education agents for that activity. So the question that's asked is about, will we see more pre-packaged courses? Yes, I think that's probably one part of the sector might respond to that. I think we'll see less. You could call it students choosing a different study experience, or you could call it course hopping, and there is a continuum between I genuinely don't like this course or I don't like this institution and I would like to go somewhere else and I can see my friends having a good study experience. Or you could see it as well, and also financial pressures, right? It's expensive to live in some key parts of Australia. So there's a range of reasons why students choose to move. So I do think that, pre-packaged programs we will see more of. I think we'll probably see less onshore transfers. I think we'll probably also see some fairly underhand behaviour start to emerge. I think it's a bit like whack-a-mole. You try and deal with it. I do think, sorry, I'm an ex-regulator, I do think we haven't dealt with some of the problems in the international education sector that the Nixon review highlighted. And while ever we have providers whose business model is less focused on genuine international education, you're going to have people looking to try and find ways around different rules that impact what they're doing. But I do also think we might see providers making it easier for students to choose to come and study with them. If they are having a poor experience, If you make it easier for a student to engage with you and work out what it's like to study with you, they won't need to use those agents as domestic students don't. Tracy, we've got 1 minute. Last reflections from you.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks everybody for joining us, taking the time out of your day to join us. I'm sorry we didn't get to every one of your questions. We are easily found, Claire, Dirk, and I, via LinkedIn. Please feel free to reach out to any one of us at any time, especially Dirk and I. If you've got any stories that you think that we should be looking at, then please get in touch. And I will just finish by saying that each one of us has our own businesses that we run, and we rely on paid employment. We do these kinds of things for free for you, but we do rely on paid employment. So sling a few dollars the Koala News way. Dirk's got a subscription, not a subscription, a sponsor plan. So get in touch with him. Claire is doing work for clients. I'm taking a slight hiatus this year, but I'll be looking for work going forward. So please keep in touch with us along those lines. But hope to see you again at the next webinar that we put on. And thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.